Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with whether the dam is breaking as more and more revelations of Trump's erratic and ill-informed incompetence emerge from Bolton's book, compounded by the Supreme Court handing him 2 defeats in a row, with today's ruling upholding DACA. And as his poll numbers plummet, a forthcoming book by his niece promises more dirty family secrets which are expected to rattle him further, while the Republican Lincoln Project runs TV ads questioning not just Trump's mental health, but ask whether he's the sick man. Jacob Heilbrunn, a senior editor at the National Interest and author of They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons, who is a columnist at the Spectator, where he has an article, The Ill-Timed Revelations of John Bolton, joins us. We will discuss how Trump is the opposite of the tough guy image he tries to project, but is in fact a weak and pathetic leader who gets regularly rolled by foreign dictators he admires and likely has financial dealings with, to the point, as Bolton says, Putin plays him like a fiddle. The question then arises, how long will Republicans in the House and Senate stand by in shameful silence while this man they privately despise ruins and weakens America? Then, with the police in Atlanta not showing up for work in what is called the blue flu following murder charges against officers who killed Rayshard Brooks, kicking his dying body and standing on his arm while proclaiming they got him. We will examine the sadistic streak in policing. Craig Futterman, a professor of law at the University of Chicago Law School and founder of the Civil Rights and Police Accountability Project at the Mandel Legal Aid Clinic, who specializes in civil rights lawsuits involving police brutality and racial discrimination, joins us to discuss how, while many police save lives, some act with impunity to take lives, in particular black lives, and what can be done to stop them. Then finally, we will speak with Rob Jackson, the co-author of a new study, Without Big Structural Changes, Emissions Are Likely to Come Back, which addresses the recent drop in CO2 emissions due to the global pandemic, which is now being reversed as countries and states reopen, with China, which accounts for a quarter of the world's carbon pollution, now back to pre-pandemic levels. A professor and a senior fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University, he joins us to discuss a promising sign that global warming can be reduced now that wind and solar prices have dropped to the point where we could have 90% clean energy by 2035. And before we go to our first guest, I want to thank you, our listeners and supporters who have donated to sustain and build Background Briefing as the radio station we broadcast from closes down and we transition to online broadcasting, particularly during this pandemic. Your donations will help us improve our recording capabilities from home, so we encourage you to throw us a lifeline and join the fact-based community of listeners we are building around the globe with your support at backgroundbriefing.org/donate. which helps keep this program independent, corporate-free, and accessible to all those who are not in a position to contribute. And joining us now is Jacob Heilbrunn, who's a senior editor at the National Interest, a columnist for The Spectator, and the author of They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons. Previously, he was an editorial writer for the Los Angeles Times, a senior editor at the New Republic, and a Japan Society Fellow. And his latest article at The Spectator is The Ill-Timed Revelations of John Bolton. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jacob Heilbrunn.
Thank you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And you and I have spoken a lot about Bolton. It feels to me like the dam is breaking here with more and more revelations about who Trump really is. And I've always argued that if you got a camera inside the Oval Office and the American people saw this out-of-control, ill-informed, mercurial, ranting, childish, foolish, idiotic, pathetic man, even his base would start to defect. So do you think that the dam is breaking? You've got Catherine Belton's book about Putin and how much he influences Trump. You've got Craig Unger's book coming out in September about Trump's ties to Russian organized crime and the extent to which he's been financed by the Russians. You've got former Secretary of Defense Mattis saying we lack mature leadership. And then you've got the general who was his chief of staff, Kelly, saying the American people should really look into more carefully and vet the people that they elect, obviously making a reference to Trump's unsuitability to be the president. So do you think that the dam is about to break here and that the scales will come off the eyes of those in America that still think this guy actually knows what he's doing?
I think the dam is breaking. Today, Trump called Bolton a disgruntled, boring fool, a dope, a sick puppy. He says this again and again about the top aides who he believes have betrayed him. None of this would matter, however, if you didn't have the triple context of his bungling of the pandemic, the economic collapse, and the racial strife that we're experiencing. If the economy was strong, Trump would be able to weather this, but it isn't. So his presidency is imploding.
Well, at the very least, it points out that he chose all these people he now calls dopes and sick puppies. I mean, the list is incredibly long. So
he said he would only hire the best, if you recall.
Right. Well, and of course, I forgot to mention, of course, today's ruling by the Supreme Court against Trump on DACA. And then that's closely followed by another ruling, which Gorsuch authored, on gay rights in the sense of that people can't be fired by their employers.
He's lost his ability to intimidate.
So, but the thing that's really strikes me, and there's always been something that has bothered me, is that people think in his base, they think he's tough and strong, and he likes to swagger and pretend he's a tough guy. And he's been mobbed up all his life. He's been a front man for the New York organized crime and then later on the Brighton Beach Russian mob. And they've been funneling money to him. So he's got this penchant for hanging out with tough guys. He always talks about toughness, toughness, toughness. That's the way he sees the world, and he sees himself as a tough guy. But actually, he's a complete wimp. He's a pathetic. I mean, foreign dictators roll him regularly, whether it's Putin, Xi Jinping, or Erdogan. I mean, that's the real record. Do you think that'll ever penetrate his base?
I don't know if it will, but I'm not really that concerned about his base. It was the independent voters that put him over the top. There's probably always going to be around 30 to 35% that is credulous enough to believe in the Trump mythos. And he is banking on that in his post-presidential career. I assume that if and when he loses this November, then he will immediately embark upon trying to erect his own television empire centered around himself. And there will still be tens of millions that believe that had Trump only not been defied by the deep state and the media elites, he would have been a successful president.
Well, there is another possibility, though, given his apparent poor health. And by the way, the Lincoln Project has got a devastating ad about Trump, suggesting that he's a sick man. We know that he's mentally ill, but the extent to which he's physically ill is not clear. As the pressure builds from Bolton's book and all these other revelations that we talked about earlier, the fact is he's always been a criminal, all of his business career. And I'm absolutely convinced, this is well sourced from intelligence sources that I've spent a lot of time with, the guy's also a traitor. So is it possible that just the pressure of the fraud being exposed, the very fraud about who he is, and this construct, without television, there wouldn't be a Donald Trump. So he's a walking and talking fraud. So at some point, deep inside that corpulent orange blubber, there's got to be a frightened little man who realizes that the gig is up. Do you think there's a possibility he can walk away from the presidency?
You mean resign?
Yeah, just give up because it's just too much for him. You know, in other words, the dam is breaking.
It seems unlikely. However, I think the book that will really hit him in the solar plexus is the forthcoming memoir, Tell-All, from his niece, Mary, who is the daughter of his older brother, Fred, whom Trump apparently treated very badly. And we know that it contains passages about Trump mocking his own father for suffering from Alzheimer's. And there's a huge amount of dirty linen that she is apparently ready to air and is airing in this book. And that will further strike at the mythos that Trump has constructed around himself. He really has lost the ability to be on the offensive. He's taken body blows from the Supreme Court in the past 2 days, and I predict that he will be increasingly defied by Republican senators as well, who are looking to desperately save their own seats this fall.
So do you think they can turn? I mean, I understand the reason why Republicans, House members and senators are so pathetically craven and loyal to this man, even though they privately despise him, is because they're afraid of his base coming out and, primarying them or making life miserable for them. Do you think they can actually show some real courage here, particularly in the Senate?
I don't know about courage, but self-preservation may start to kick in. They're in a very difficult place. I mean, the GOP may well be headed for a landslide defeat this fall. And it would be no small irony if the true legacy of Donald Trump were to have resurrected not only Joe Biden, but the entire Democratic Party, which looked to be in pretty bad shape a few years ago. Now they're roaring on the state level, and they've taken over the House. They may well win the Senate this fall, as well as the presidency, and control all three branches of government.
But the Republican Party is collapsing like the Whigs did in the 1850s, and the Whigs were replaced in part by the know-nothings. And that's what we have today in the Republican Party. It's no longer a conservative party. It's a reactionary party. So isn't this a long-term prognosis for the GOP? And one wonders what will happen to the Mitt Romneys. Where will they go?
Well, there will be a battle royale after the election between the Chamber of Commerce types who want the Republican Party to remain a plutocratic party, and then between the sort of Josh Hawley and Tom Cottons who are trying to ride in a shrewder fashion than Trump the base that he identified. So the Republican Party, if the election turns out very badly for it, will go through one of those soul-searching experiences. And it's not impossible that the party completely collapses and something new emerges from the rubble.
And again, I'm speaking with Jacob Heilbrunn, who's a senior editor at the National Interest, a columnist for The Spectator, and the author of They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons. Previously, he was an editorial writer for the Los Angeles Times, a senior editor at the New Republic, and a Japan Society Fellow. And his latest article at The Spectator is The Ill-Timed Revelations of John Bolton. So just to touch on some of the revelations, and of course there's a desperate second attempt by the Justice Department to stop it, even though it was cleared by the National Security Council and there isn't any classified stuff in it, and that's now what they're trying to claim. And in fact, Bolton himself said that so much of it he had to take out had nothing to do with classified material. It was just basically quotes from Trump himself, and he had to remove the quotation marks. So there's a lot more in the book, apparently, that really is quoting Trump. But Bolton basically says that Trump engaged in a pattern of fundamentally unacceptable behavior that eroded the very legitimacy of the presidency, and he engaged in behavior that looked like obstruction of justice as a way of life, which we couldn't accept. And that, of course, goes back to the tutoring of Roy Cohn. That's the way he is. Do you think, though, that the point that we were talking about earlier, about him being the world's weakest leader, and he's totally undermined this country and weakened us, and this is beyond belief. Putin and Xi and Erdogan, they can't believe their luck. In fact, Bolton said that Putin plays him like a fiddle. So my understanding, by the way, Jacob, is that Mitch McConnell and some of these other Republican senators are actually close friends of Bolton's. How does this information hit them, do you think? That they're participating in the weakening of America. That's the point, surely.
They know everything. None of this is a mystery to McConnell or the other Republicans. They just held their nose and reveled in the fact that they could pass these sweeping tax cuts and get as many judges, federal judges, appointed as possible. That was a Faustian bargain that they struck. And for the most part, it held. Now you see Chief Justice John Roberts rebelling at this compact, and even Gorsuch was only prepared to go so far. So the conservatives are starting to wonder what they actually ultimately did derive from the relationship with Trump. I think Trump is in a vulnerable and exposed position right now.
Well, but my understanding is he's in the same position that Netanyahu is in Israel, where he's got to stay in office because of the parliamentary protection. And in Trump's case, he needs another 4 years to stay out of prison. Is that what's looming in the back of Trump's mind?
It certainly has to be a concern. He can always pardon himself after the election in November, which I don't think he would hesitate to do. He would issue a sweeping pardon to himself and his immediate family for any crimes committed while in office. And he has enough resources to engage in protracted litigation after he leaves office. Now, it'll be interesting to see, does the Supreme Court rule that his tax records can be handed over to Congress and to the Southern District of New York? Because the court has not been ruling in Trump's favor now.
Well, that will, particularly the taxes, will reveal how much Russian money has been propping him up all this time. And that could be very significant. But
we should be careful, though. There probably is likely a good deal of Saudi money as well, Chinese money. I don't think that Trump is overly choosy about his financial backers.
Well, that's the sort of subtext in Bolton's book, isn't it? When he talks about Giuliani obviously having financial ties to these pro-Russian crooks in Ukraine, there's also indications with Trump's dealings with the Chinese companies ETE and the Heilbrunn, the Turkish bank. Trump is trying to do favors for these dictators. The assumption is that he has financial interests as well. Isn't that the subtext?
Yes, and who knows what Jared Kushner has been up to in his position. He could be even more exposed than Trump, because there would be a natural inclination for the Justice Department to tread warily in prosecuting a former president. But in the case of Kushner, no such hesitation would apply.
Well, I've always thought that Kushner is possibly Trump's bagman. That's the way that third world dictators work. That's the way, for example, in Mexico under Raul Salinas, his brother was his bagman who made all the dirty deals. So is that a possibility?
I think they all operate. I'd be surprised. I think they're all operating in their own interests.
Uh-huh.
And my suspicion would be that Kushner protects himself. Trump would have no hesitation in throwing him overboard if it served his own purposes. The only one of the children that he seems to care about is Ivanka.
Yeah, and she's making all kinds of deals. And remember, the Chinese gave her all those copyrights early on.
They could.
MBS gave her $100 million.
Yeah, they could be. There may be, if Biden wins the presidency, we'll learn a lot more about what's been actually happening these past 4 years.
All of which has been detrimental to the United States, though. Isn't that the bottom line, is that this man has been systematically weakening this country, looting it, and turning the air and polluting the air and the water, and undoing not just everything that Obama did, but all of the safeguards that we have for our food, air, water, you name it.
It's a return to the 19th century style of government, where you just loot the environment and don't worry about the consequences down the road. Trump has emboldened many of these forces. And I actually don't see him as a complete outlier in the Republican Party, but in some ways the apotheosis, since he is himself a plutocrat who has taken the approach of using the base as a vehicle to power. This was always done. It was just done in a more subtle fashion by other Republican presidents. But Trump has been more open and explicit about it.
Yeah, but if it's made clear that he's a traitor and that there's a network that the Russians seem to have with Nunez, I mean, for the life of me, two of Nunez's proteges, Michael Ellis on the National Security Council, is the guy that is carrying Trump's water to go after Bolton after he'd been cleared by the National Security Council. Then Ellis intervened. Remember, Ellis is the guy that Vindman mentioned, who was the guy that classified in that secret server all of Trump's phone call with the Ukrainian president. And then you've got Kash Patel, another protege of Nunez, who's now the deputy DNI. What's going on with these people? I mean, they remember a long time ago, Kevin McCarthy said to the former House Speaker, Paul Ryan, I swear to God, Trump and Dana Rohrabacher are on Putin's payroll, at which point Paul Ryan said, well, let's not talk about that. So there's something deeper, I think, in terms of treachery. It's not just Trump. It feels as if somehow Putin is not just controlling our president, but he's also compromising the Republican Party or elements in it.
Well, the Russia angle, we had the Mueller report, but it has largely died away, hasn't it? I think Trump's greatest weakness isn't Russia. I think what's going to take him down is this pandemic. It's the domestic issues. The Russia thing, whatever the veracity of the charges, has never proven potent politically against Trump. It's too abstract for the American public. And it wasn't until the coronavirus that his incompetence and malignancy was fully exposed.
Well, just in closing, that would seem to be a no-brainer, right? We have the highest number of deaths, the greatest number of cases than any other country in the world. And who's responsible? Why are we worse off when we are the richest and most powerful nation on the earth? That's got to make people see the obvious, surely, at least one would think.
Especially as the number of cases surge in the red states. And he's holding a super spreader event in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He's literally killing his own followers.
Well, Jacob, I thank you for joining us here. And I appreciate your work in the past on Bolton. And what an irony that as Bolton may be one of the nails in Trump's coffin.
Well, Trump should have remembered the title of Bolton's memoir from the UN, Surrender is Not an Option. He's not surrendering to Trump now. He's targeting him for destruction and for a new form of regime change in Washington.
Well, I thank you again for joining us, Jacob Heilbrunn.
Thank you, Ian.
And again, I've been speaking with Jacob Heilbrunn, who's a senior editor at the National Interest, a columnist for the Spectator, and the author of They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons. Previously, he was an editorial writer for the Los Angeles Times, a senior editor at the New Republic, and a Japan Society Fellow. And his latest article at the Spectator is The Ill-Timed Revelations of John Bolton.